Okay, welcome everyone. We're very excited for the session today. I imagine many of you are either already into planning for 2025 at this point, or will be starting very soon. And so our objective for today is to give you all some real world concepts and methodologies that you can use to improve the territory planning process at your organizations. Looking at the types of approaches we used to implement as consultants working with organizations on territory planning projects. We're really with the goal being to take a more analytically driven approach to designing territories. But before we get into the content today, maybe just some quick introductions from us. I'm Kyle Webster. I'm the Chief of Staff at Forma AI. I've spent the last 10 years or so in the sales effectiveness space, a good chunk of which I spent in management consulting, working with organizations on territory planning, quota setting, and a lot of work in sales compensation strategy and design across a wide array of industries. And I'm also joined by Dave Girardi, and I'll pass it over to him to introduce himself.
All right, thanks, Kyle. Yes, great to meet everyone. Again, my name is David. I have around 13 years experience, very similar to Kyle, and a mix of experience here at Forma and also in management consulting space, working with a few dozen companies in the area, same area of targeting, Salesforce, sizing, design, segmentation for customers, and also call planning and Salesforce sizing. So I've kind of done the gamut of all the Salesforce effectiveness space, as well as focusing in incentive comp administration. And looking forward to chatting today about getting a little bit more hands-on and specific about one very important topic to the sales performance management space.
Amazing. Okay, so we can dive in. So I'm going to provide a quick just intro and agenda for what we're going to cover today. But I think before we get into the meat of the discussion, I think let's just level set on the importance of good territory planning. So I mean, at the end of the day, good territory planning it's an optimization problem. We're trying to create alignment between a seller's capacity and the workload required to effectively cover the territory. When it's done right, we ensure that customers are well covered, we deliver better customer relationships, and ultimately we capitalize on sales opportunity and create revenue. We also maintain a motivated sales force that believes they can hit their goals in their comp plan. And of course, if we get it wrong, we risk leaving revenue on the table with inadequately covered customers and an unmotivated sales team that feels like they don't have the opportunity to necessarily hit their goals. And so if we jump to the next slide, the way that we look at this, there are three kind of key pillars to effective territory planning. And this is really going to serve as the foundation for the discussion today, as we talk through each of these in a little bit more detail. And so number one is understanding the untapped potential within your customer base. So if we're just setting territories based, only at looking at historical sales and not taking into account, where there is the most potential for growth, we're potentially leaving a lot of revenue on the table. So we're gonna cover how to think about including customer potential in your territory planning process. Once we have an understanding of where potential exists, we need to have a framework to objectively assess the size and relative balance of any given territory, across our sellers. So, we know where we should be making changes to optimize coverage. And so we're gonna spend a little bit of time walking through how to do that. And then the last step is actually, carving and adjusting territories, so we ensure that they are balanced. So, a lot of organizations jump, all the way right to this step. But, when you think about data-driven territory planning, a lot of that really happens in steps 1 and 2 here. So, that's where we're going to spend a lot of time during the discussion today. And then we'll wrap up the session by going through some really common questions on territory planning that, end up coming up over and over again. And then the only point that I want to quickly highlight before we just jump into the content here is, just in relation to the content that we're going to go through today, the one thing that we're not going to get deep into is Salesforce sizing, which is determining, the number of salespeople you should have in your organization. So for today, we're going to assume we already know how many salespeople we need, and we're solving for how to optimally deploy them via balanced territories. Sizing is a really important topic, but it's a bit of a separate step in the process that happens before we actually get into carving territories. So not where we're going to focus time today, but potentially will in a future session. But with that, I'll pass it over to Dave, who's going to cover the first bucket for us.
All right, great. So, as Kyle mentioned, if we are to look at our current sales or our historical sales based on our customer base, it's very simple to figure out essentially where all of my sales reps should spend their time. I'm just have one metric. I know the sales of all my customers. This is how I'm going to deploy them. But if we're going to go one step further, what is optimal for obviously growing your business is to figure out what is the ultimate potential spend of all of my customers? And is that historical sales plus potential spend equally distributed amongst my sales reps, such that all my sales reps have a customer base that has a similar workload and a similar kind of potential revenue target for the organization. And obviously, there's going to be differences from territory to territory, but we want this to be as balanced as possible. And so potential is really the hard part in all of this and figuring out what that should be. And it's extremely important, not just to targeting strategy and designing your territories, but it's extremely important in quota setting to figure out how much potential, how much growth of revenue that I'm looking for should I be distributing amongst my sales reps as well. And wanted to point out as well in this is that there's a lot of different ways to view potentialization, but so it can range in complexity quite a bit. But what we're going to do today is not go too deep into all of the difficult statistical models that you could build to accurately predict potential. But we're going to walk through kind of like more of a toy car example of saying this is a very primitive way, but probably gets you most of the answer and is definitely going to get you into the right direction. So, the foundation where we want to set the discussion up is looking at a bar example. So, the picture says it all right now. An empty bar. This is, if we could imagine, this is a territory with far too little workload. And then we could also imagine the next picture of something with way too much workload, right? So tons and tons of customers, don't know much about them at this point, but we know that it's a lot. And the goal of this exercise is to figure out how do we balance the territory, this bar, such that we are doing it in a way that keeps in mind both what they've spent and what we think they will spend. And so this is essentially the crux of the problem. And we could use a whole bunch of different data sources. We could look at market share if we actually had that kind of data. But potentialization, usually in the absence of market share, is really trying to figure out, that growth opportunity based on a whole slew of different variables that we have at our disposal. So essentially, the crux of the problem, we are trying to estimate a total spend figure for each customer, and then use that in aggregate across all of our different territories to figure out, are they equally balanced and is there an equal workload amongst them all? So you can see here in the picture depicted, we have a whole bunch of different customers. Some have spent money. We have one that hasn't spent any money. We know, or we have an estimate of what their budget's going to be. So we can take the subtraction of what we think their budget's going to be minus their current spend and look at a potential. So this is kind of the way that we want to think about this problem. And sorry, I was one slide behind, but essentially the picture right now is showing that problem I alluded to of this kind of data-driven approach of calculating that potential spend based on the budget. So the beginning step in all of this is figuring out what our customer universe is. And this involves thinking about not just our current customers, but our potential customers and our past customers as well. So figuring out what does that full universe look like, matching up, bringing in all the data that we have about these different customers in terms of, their, maybe it's their industries, maybe it's their employee size, maybe it's their historical spend, the different products that they've purchased from us in the past. But essentially, what we want to do is get that customer universe down and then start analyzing it and developing our potentialization formula. And there's essentially, once we have this master universe list, there's kind of two different approaches we can take from this. Is that we can do a light touch approach, as I was alluding to before, of saying that there's a very high level segmentation approach to get mostly to the answer in the right direction that can drive good decision making. And then there is a very deep analytical approach that could involve a far deeper analysis, more data. We could start looking at correlation, relationships between variables. You can start looking at essentially the definition of what a high spend customer is, and then start matching your customer universe with the attributes that are similar amongst non-customers versus high spend customers. But ultimately, we don't want anyone to be too frightened of the kind of this word potentialization. Oh, I have to have some big, deep analytical model to figure out the potential spend. You can get there in a very light touch approach by looking at maybe a couple different variables at a high level and kind of using the knowledge of your business, of your past customers, to figure out kind of, bucket things in more coarse definitions to get to, 80% of the answer. And that's where I want to take it on the next slide, which will then, we've created a kind of a dummy problem that we can then show everyone how we would actually do this in practice, so that this isn't just kind of a theoretical discussion that we're having today. So in the next slide, we're going to zoom in on this light touch approach, and we're going to use an illustrative example of the great widget company who makes widgets and has essentially two territories to make this very simple. They have around 20 different customers, and the sales reps are farmers who are assigned one single quota for maintaining and growing their current customer business. And so what we want to do is figure out, are these two territories, we want to develop an index such that we can optimally balance the workload and the potential in these two different territories amongst the customers that you see. And so the data that we have to in this problem is that we know the current historical sales of all of these different customers. And then what we've decided to say is that we brought in the number of employees that work at each of one of these customers. And that's going to give us, what we're saying is that in the absence of more rich data, what we're saying is that this is going to give us a fairly good estimate of the size of this company. And once we know the size of this company, we can get a decent estimate of what we think their maximum potential sales could be with our company, Great Widget. And so if I move to the next slide, we're going to do a very simple bucketing exercise in order to segment all of our different customers. And so what we're saying here is that we're going to bucket all of our customers into three different segments: small, medium, large. It's going to depend entirely based on the employee size, because again, we have nothing else to measure these companies by in this example. And we're going to say any company under 100 employees, their maximum spend is going to be $100. And then anything over 300 employees is going to be considered large, and their max spend is going to be 1,000. And then a medium-sized company is everything in the middle that is going to have a max spend of $300. And so this is going to be essentially our we've added these two columns to this table, and we've said we've bucketed them to segments. We know what their max spend is. And so if I move to the next slide, it's a simple calculation to figure out what the incremental potential is. So remember, we want to look at this from an approach of, we know what they currently spend. We want to know the value, the incremental value that we have not tapped yet. So essentially, we could call this incremental potential. It's sometimes called untapped potential. But essentially, if we were to do this at a customer level, roll it up at the territory level into territory A and B, and we can see here clearly that we have territory A has more total current sales of $2,500 and also far more potential. Conversely, territory B has kind of similar current sales, just $400 less, but their customers in that territory, the way that this has been distributed in the past, their customers represent far less potential in incremental untapped, right? And so it would be easy to say, well, should we just, throw a few accounts here and there? But there is a far more analytical approach that Kyle's going to walk through in a few slides of how we would actually do this in a what we call an indexing methodology, right? So now that it's kind of set up, we have this problem, we have unbalanced territories, we want to figure out how unbalanced they truly are, and then we want to redistribute them such that they become balanced. And so again, I know that was a very kind of high level course example, but there are far more advanced models that we can use and that are also readily available in different platforms like ourselves here at Forma. But essentially, it comes down to whether or not we have data that allows us to profile our different customers, that allows us to segment them, that allows us to kind of say, what does a high spending customer walk and talk like? And do I have the data and do I have the modeling techniques to figure out those correlated customers that I essentially have not untapped at this different point? So again, we'll push this aside for now, but just want to let you know that there are far more ways to do this other than the simple 3-bucket exercise that we've started out with. But I'll pass it to Kyle to now go to the next step of, let's now develop our index, our workload index, and then we'll develop a balanced set of territories A and B.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Dave. So yeah, so Dave's walked through really how to go about estimating the unaddressed potential within the account base, which is obviously going to serve as a big input to the territory planning process. But as he mentioned, it might not be the only metric that we want to look at when determining if a territory is well balanced and if we have equitable workload across all of our reps. So what we're going to cover next is creating a territory index score, which is what we're going to actually use to compare one territory, against another to understand if, any given territory is, too big, too small, or the right size. And so when you think about, what is a territory index, it's effectively, it's an analytical technique used to assign relative values to territories so that we can evaluate balance sales opportunity across our reps. So the output is a score at a territory level based on, one or more quantitative measures, such as historical sales or potential or workload. And so what does this actually mean? And so if we jump to the next slide, I'm actually gonna start with showing you what the end result of an analysis like this can look like. So we're aligned on what we're trying to get to, and then we can actually dive in and walk through a little bit more tactically how to do the analysis and create an index score. And what we're trying to get to at the end of the day, again, is a numerical index score per territory so that we can evaluate workload. So generally, the way we set this up, we have a point system that takes into account a number of metrics, and that's what you see on the left-hand side of the screen. This is literally just laying out how the point system works. And so the way to read this is, if we have a territory that ends up with exactly 1,000 points, that represents a perfectly balanced territory across the metrics that we're including in the index. And, this is what we're targeting. Now, not every territory is going to be, a perfectly evenly, down to the decimal point, balanced territory across our metrics. So we're generally going to set an acceptable range. So here from, 800 points to 1200 points represents a well-balanced territory that doesn't necessarily require change, or that isn't where we would necessarily focus our effort for recarving. So, we're still at the level of, a well-staffed and well-attended, bar or coffee shop, to take it back to the example at the beginning. But anything less than 800 points represents a territory that does not have enough opportunity and work. So effectively, you'll have an underutilized sales resource. And anything more than 1,200 points, you'll have a territory with too much opportunity and work for one salesperson to handle. So you'll effectively have unaddressed sales opportunity because the sales resource is spread too thin. And, when we run this analysis, what we can produce is something that looks like what we have on the right side of the slide here. And so just to set up what you're looking at, on the vertical axis, you have the territory index score. So it kind of maps to what you have on the left. You can see the line at 1,000, running across the graph, and you have the lines at 800 and 1,200, effectively showing the range for a balanced territory. And then what we have is all of our individual territories ranked from low to high based on the index score. So each territory is represented by a single purple dot here. So you can see the territories on the left with the lowest index score, and you can see the territories all the way to the right with the highest. And so what this is showing us is that, a good chunk of our territories are within a reasonable index score range, but we have, three on the bottom that are potentially too small and, need to have, more accounts, more geography added to them to help balance them out. And then we have four on the top end that are, potentially under-resourced and could either be, split, or we could reallocate some of the territory to those that are under-indexed ones. So the net of this is the index score gives us effectively an objective measure that we can use to evaluate territory balance and, look at territories relative to one another easily during the planning process. And so we're going to circle back to this at the end, but I wanted to start with the target outcome. And now we can go through how to actually create this. And so the kind of final thing before we jump back into our example, but at the end of the day, like the index score it's just a relative score taking into account one or more territory metrics. And, there are a number of different metrics and metric types that we can use to create the index. Some of the most common being, historical sale amounts and, potential sales, with the objective of evenly distributing market potential across territories. That's what Dave focused on in section 1, and that's where we're going to focus, a lot of the example today. But there are other metrics that can be used, looking more at, activity and capacity type metrics, like actually mapping out, call volume requirements for different segments of accounts and stuff like that, that can also feed into an index score indexing analysis. Okay, so, how to actually create a territory index. So what we're going to do is, walk through the steps that need to be completed to create an index score. And then we're going to walk through a really simple example to bring it to life and show how it can be used in the territory planning process. So step 1, the first thing that we need to do is identify the metrics that we actually want to use in the index score, so that we can bring in the right data. This is going to vary depending on what type of role and territory we're creating the index for, as we're trying to identify what metrics we're trying to balance across all of our representatives, looking at opportunity and workload within the territory. So if we're looking at a role that's primarily focused on renewing software contracts, the value of the upcoming renewal contracts is something we might bring into our index. if we're looking at a salesperson selling, residential building products, we might want to bring in, new housing starts as a metric in, a geographic area, which could be like a proxy for potential. And, Dave's going to spend a little bit of time at the end on how to prioritize these metrics a little bit more. Step two is we then just need to aggregate all of this data and we need to define our index parameters. So generally, we're going to want to bring in all of the data at a customer level if we can. It can be at a more aggregated level if we need to, like zip code. But ideally, we have it at a customer level. We also need to define our parameters, such as the number of territories that we're going to be balancing across, and the weighting of each metric in our index. And then step three is simply, running the analysis to allocate the index points to each territory so we can see the relative balance of each. And then lastly, we're going to, actually adjust our territories based on the index scores and, watch as they update and use it as a tool. So after reviewing our index score, we might decide that, territory A is too big and move some of the accounts to territory B. And, we'll be able to use the index score to see when we've moved enough accounts to balance out the territories. But let's dive into our example. We're going to pick up kind of what we started in section one. And we're just going to go through kind of those 4 steps in a little bit more detail. And, again, of course, this is an overly simple example, but we're going to use it just to highlight some of the concepts here. And so the first step being the identification of the metrics we want to include in our index. We've got 3 metrics available. We've got number of accounts in the territory. We have incremental potential and historical sales. The roles responsible for managing and growing existing run rate customers and also selling to new. So we're going to create our index off of new potential and historical sales and make sure we bring that into our data. Step 2 is we're going to compile all of our data, which you can see in the 2 views at the bottom of the slide here. We have our detailed account level data, and we're also rolling it up to a territory level, which is what you see on the right. So we have, again, 20 accounts here. They're assigned out to 2 territories. Each territory right now has 10 accounts, but based on the makeup of the customers, you can see that the historical sales and potential values are pretty different across the territories. We go on to the next slide. Okay, so staying on step 2 here, what you have at the top of the slide, it's effectively a repeat of the table that we were just looking at on the last. It just has our metrics at a territory level. The only thing that I've added here is the relative percentage of each metric. So for example, 61% of the total potential sits in territory 1 and 39% sits in territory 2. And so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to define our parameters. So we're going to determine the total number of index points that we want to allocate out to the territories. In this case, we have 2 territories, so we're going to allocate 2,000 points. So we can see the relative spread across the territories. If we were doing this across 120 territories, you'd be allocating out 120,000 points. We also need to decide on the weightings of each of the metrics in our index. So, in this case, we're going to do 40% based on historical sales and 60% based on potential. And then what we're going to do is we're going to run a relatively simple weighted calculation to allocate these points out across the territories. And that's what you see at the bottom. So the way to read this is we have 2,000 points to allocate and a 40-60 weighting. So this means that we're going to allocate 800 points based on historical sales and 1,200 points based on potential. Then we're going to allocate across the territories. So territory 1 has 61% of the potential. So they get 61% of the 1,200 points for the 733. And so that's what's happening here at the bottom of the table. We're calculating out the 2,000 points across the territories, which gives us a final index score of 1170 and 830 for each of the 2 territories. Now, of course, you're never really going to do this for only 2 territories, but this gives us just an idea of how the math works. And then finally, we're able to look at the results and actually make changes to the territory definitions if we wanted to balance out the scores. So, in this case, based on the thresholds we talked about at the beginning of the section, the 800 and the 1,200, these territories are actually like reasonably well balanced, but let's say that we want to bring them closer in line by making some changes to the accounts that are assigned to each territory. So like, let's say that we want to take account J and we want to move it from territory 1 to territory 2, which you can, let's see, it's what we're doing here in the table. Um, and so you can see the before and after of moving the accounts. You can see um, if we go on to the next slide after we've actually made the change, you can see the actual territory metrics like sales and potential, how those have changed by moving the account. But you can also see the associated index scores. They're also going to update so that now you can see both territories are very close to the 1,000 mark. And so again, kind of overkill for 2 territories, but if you imagine having 300 territories here, this approach allows you to easily identify the highest potential territories for rebalancing and gives you really a single objective measurement or benchmark to make the change. And you can have different index score methodologies for different types of roles and different types of territories. So again, for example, like a new business hunter team is going to have a totally different index score methodology versus like a set of renewal focused account managers. And so if we want to jump onto the next slide, but if we, you think about working through this process with sales managers and leaders, the index score, it takes multiple important metrics and it rolls them into like a single benchmark that can be used to support the recarving process. You can work with sales management kind of live to move around the accounts or the geographies, and you can see kind of in real time how it impacts the index score to balance out territories. And at the end of the day, as we've gone through here, it's not really an overly complex analysis, the way that some of the potentialization models and analysis can be. But it's a good way to synthesize the different data points when you're balancing territories. So kind of in summary here, as we walk through, territory design, it's an optimization problem at the end of the day. We're trying to align sales rep capacity with workload so that we're capturing as much as we can. And territory indexing is going to be a tool that we have in the toolbox to help with that. It's going to help us, combine the outputs of models such as, potentialization or call volume planning into, an objective metric that we can use to balance. It's going to primarily help us identify the territories that are, too large or too small so that we can try to flatten the curve that you see on the right side of the page here. Trying to go from, the light purple dots to the dark purple where all territories are within our desired range. Just because at the end of the day, if we have territories that are, completely unbalanced, we're going to be leaving revenue on the table. And other sales effectiveness levers like comp plan design changes aren't going to be as effective as if we have really fair, balanced, and equitable territories. So that's a little bit of a primer on indexing. I'll pass it back to Dave to close this out. I'm just going to address just some of the common questions that come up when going through some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I'm going to start. Thanks, Kyle. I'm going to start with a common question that we don't have that perhaps just occurred to me while we were going through the example. I just wanted to make sure that it's kind of clear that when we're rebalancing a territory like this, it's not kind of, I'm just wondering if people might be thinking this could be a kind of a blind exercise where you move one account to another territory, you recalculate at the territory level, and you go, is it balanced or not? What you can actually do, I know we showed that we are calculating the 437 as an example index point for territory 1, 363 for territory 2. You can actually do this not at the territory level, but at the account level. So you could look at account number A and do $50 divided by all of the dollars that are across territories A and B, and actually at this stage get a index not just for territory 1 and 2, but you can get an index value for every account within those territories. So then when you're looking at, well, which one should I move from territory 1 or 2, you can actually see, well, customer J represents 5 index points, whereas customer K represents 2. And so it's actually, we're showing it for simplicity here at the territory level, but it's actually an exercise done at a very specific account level. So I think hopefully that might cover one question, is like, how do I do this when I'm rebalancing? But there's a couple others that we wanted to go over that we kind of anticipated that people will ask, and I've even actually seen in the Q&A so far. And so the main question is, how do I determine which metrics to use as proxies? And so I kind of alluded to this before, but ultimately what you need to do, especially in the absence of perhaps more rich data, is figure out, what does a high value customer look like to me? And then repeat that exercise for medium and low value. And in the past, when I've done this, it's about creating cohorts of different customers, and which are essentially segments, and saying, I'm going to analyze everything I can about these customers, whether it be the industry they're in. Is it the products that they've purchased in the past from us? Is it the number of, if I'm looking at a renewal sales force, is it the number of complaints that they've had or they've issued over the past year? Is it essentially it could be things like NPS scores. It could be anything that we can say is this a high value customer that's spending a lot of money? And then once I figure out the variables that actually define that cohort called high value, I'm going to look at everybody else, and then try and pick out my customer universe that aren't current customers, and figure out, okay, all of these people look exactly like the high values, therefore I'm going to assign them a similar spend as my current customers today that I deemed high value. So that's essentially the exercise you have to go through. It's which variables do I have access to, and how do I correlate these to the customers that I know are spending, a certain threshold, whether it be $1,000 a year with us, whether it be $100 a year, whatever high, medium, and low looks like to you. And again, high, medium, low is a very coarse way of doing it. Other approaches could be that you actually decile your customers, right? And you look at 10 different segments of value and start looking at it at a finer level like that. You could split it out into multiple dimensions. You could look at the decile in terms of high 10 different thresholds of value in terms of their perhaps potential spend. And then you could add a second dimension, that's what industry are they in? Because I know for my business that customers in industry A spend a lot more than me compared to customers in industry B. And so essentially it's that exercise that really unlocks what does my final prediction model look like for potentialization. So I'll move on to question 2. How do you decide which weights to use in your index? So I think in the example we showed, it was a 60-40 split. But essentially, the way that this comes, the way that you decide on this, and there's no, tried and true methodology, or there's no single right answer, essentially. It differs for every different business. But you need to choose weights that approximately represent the relative work involved between the variables you're using and how much work the rep should be spending on certain activities. So as an example, if your index in our example was 60 and 40, you're saying that 60%, essentially retaining $1 of historical spend is worth, the ratio, it's essentially worth 1.5 times more than a future untapped potential dollar if my weighting is 60-40. If my weighting is 50-50, you're saying that the amount of work I'm having my reps do, I'm saying that it's as much work for them. They're spending 50% of their time on historical retention dollars, and then 50% of their time on growth. So if I had, as an example, a sales team that was a retention team, and I've charged them with retaining all my current customers and trying to grow all my accounts a little bit in terms of new products or incremental licenses, etc., it might make more sense to have something like a 90-10 split, where you're saying, the work that my reps are doing, 90% of it is spent on retaining historical dollars, and 10% is spent on the future growth. So in that case, it wouldn't make sense to use something like a 50-50 weighting. It would make sense to heavily weight the index to the work and activities that they're actually doing, if that makes sense to everyone. And so that's essentially the game that you play of deciding on your different weights. Again, there's no huge difference between deciding if that 90-10 split should be 85-15, but essentially it's cataloging the amount of time that reps are spending based on what you've decided is your workload index. And the last question that we had for the audience, that is a common one in this exercise, is that how do I recarve or redesign my territories if there's a reduction or increase in your sales force size? And essentially, what this comes down to is, Kyle alluded to the fact in our example, there was 2,000 points that were out there in the universe because we had 2 territories and 2 sales reps. But essentially, you need to reset the index such that number of index points that are out there is your new headcount size. So if you're going to reduce by, let's say, 10 reps, you're going to have far less index points out there. If you have the same amount of customers, you repeat the exercise, you redistribute all the index points to all the different customers out there, you sum it back up, and then you start redoing your rebalancing exercise. And so essentially, you're always just renormalizing to that total headcount of your sales force in the end. And so you just essentially just redo the calculation and rebalance. And I think that was all the questions that we had anticipated. I'm just trying to do a quick scan through the Q&A to see if there's anything else that we haven't covered. I don't know, Kyle, if you managed, if there's anything that jumped out to you that we didn't target yet.
I mean, there's one in here, if a threshold, is there a threshold for the number of territories that you're carving for, a vertical or a segment or a region, as you go through the approach versus just saying like, this is a new motion, everyone's going to have like really big patches. So, is the effort worth the squeeze? I think I know that's a good one just on like the usability of the methodology. I mean, from my perspective, if you have a really large TAM or like total addressable market and you're looking at, all of North America and you need to divide it into 4 territories, I would agree that you probably don't need to get down into like a super granular detailed potentialization methodology, but at the end of the day, there's still like some level of value in, carving those in a way that is like it is balanced and equitable. So in those types of cases, like I think you can use like a very light touch version of this just to help support the balancing. So I wouldn't say there's necessarily like a bottom floor where it makes no sense. I do agree though that you probably want to tailor the methodology a little bit based on the complexity and how balanced things need to be given the size of the market.
Yeah. I also see a question about introducing at what point would you introduce a productivity analysis? Would that be something to include in this indexing? Just in case I might be misunderstanding productivity analysis, but it does make me think of something that I wanted to make clear earlier, in that in terms of the productivity involved in working different sizes of accounts needs to be accounted for in the index. So as an example, in the territory or the indexing that we had, the weighting, the variables, everything that came together was such that territory A and B were balanced in the end, with 9 accounts in one and 11 in the other. It's possible that when you develop all of the data that you use, your indexing weights and everything, it could result in the fact that your index tells you that a territory with 2 gigantic accounts is equal in workload, air quotes, to a territory with 1,000 very low value accounts. And that's something that you also have to understand when you're assigning that kind of that value and developing your index, that it has to be such that, so it has to be designed in a way that these territories are actually workable in the end. So there are some kind of qualitative um, things that you have to do when you end up looking at the results and saying that, this doesn't really make sense. Because again, when Kyle was describing it before, the whole concept of indexing relies on the relative value of customers amongst different territories. And so, someone with an account with an index with 2 index points is essentially worth twice as much as an account with one index point, right? And so you have to understand that you can't just create a territory with 1,000 1 index point accounts, because we all know in the end that that is not actually workable. A rep probably can't contact that many in a given year. And so the actual product, the essentially the points and the way that you develop your index has to square with the actual amount of productivity and work that it takes to essentially work a single account, if that makes sense to everyone.
There's another one in here which I think is an interesting one of like how do you measure the impact of rebalancing? And I mean, and is it sales uplift? Is it rep productivity increases? And I think that's an interesting one. And I mean, I think it's something I've looked at in the past is effectively doing an analysis of like, okay, we assign out all of our index points. We actually look at like the difference or the delta in performance between a territory that is like wildly over indexed versus those that are within the band, because it does also serve as a good validation point of are the reps actually potentially spread too thin? So like one example of doing that was, we looked at all of the territories that were at like, 17, 18, 1900 points and compared them against the territories that were closer to the 1,000 mark. And basically what we saw is a drop off in retention rates because again, the rep was spread too thin, as well as a lower level of like net new sale penetration. So the actual net new dollar amount might have been kind of equal to other territories, but they weren't actually capturing as much of the potential within the territory as reps that were like more equally indexed. So you can do that type of analysis, and then you want to carry that forward. So like when you make the changes for the following years, are those territories that you've split, you've recarved now, falling into line with the trend of the kind of core index territories.
Yeah, I think also, seeing there's the question of the measuring the impact of rebalancing. It is a very difficult exercise because there's so many different variables that come into play. So when you are rebalancing, you're saying, hey, to your sales force, you're saying, look, everyone now has a pool of accounts or customers that have a similar potential. You all have a fair shot essentially of hitting your quota and achieving revenue for this company. But it is difficult because we know that not all sales reps are exactly the same, right? We know that there is a human element to it, that they're not all necessarily going to perform properly. And so you could look at an analysis of previous years of saying, hey, who did we say is high potential, and years down the road, did they actually achieve any revenue growth? Did we retain these customers? Did we actually grow them? If not, was there something wrong in our formula? Was there something wrong in our assessment of potential, or is it the reps that was the issue? And so they're not simple analyses to do, but I think that you have to do data cuts like that and measuring over time, and then measuring them across the entire sales force. Because as we all know, if you see that essentially you have missed the mark on identifying high potential customers, and it's something that has occurred across many territories, I think it's something that you can isolate to the potentialization model. If it's something that hasn't spread across territories, if it's something more localized and perhaps different regions of the country or just within a few reps, you can probably identify that, no, we got the potentialization right. We probably just didn't have a good performing rep in that particular territory. And so I just wanted to highlight, yeah, it is a very difficult thing to analyze and value in the end because of that human element.
Okay, I don't see as many coming in now. Maybe this is a good place to call it for today. Can give everybody a few minutes of transition time before your next meeting. But thank you everyone, very, very much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we're looking forward to seeing everyone at our upcoming masterclass sessions on quota planning and sales incentive design. So hope everyone has a great rest of your day and week, and look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, thank you.